Hello, D.G. Cameron here. I'm the author of two books. One, The Great Electroconvulsive Therapy Hoax, Volume 1, Manufacture, Fraud, and Deception, and two, The Great Electroconvulsive Therapy Hoax, Volume 2, Manufacture, Fraud, and Deception. They're all about the machines of ECT, of electroconvulsive therapy, all about the manufacturers and the machine. All the information I'm going to be providing here comes from my two volumes. Today we're going to discuss some specific fraud committed by MECTA and Somatics, two of the main brief pulse ECT manufacturers in the United States. So I'm going to show you how these two manufacturers have covered up the power of their machines. First of all, between 1976 and 1982, there was an investigation of ECT because the FDA came in for the first time to monitor all medical devices. They were given this mandate by Congress in 1976. So the investigation for ECT was one of the first things they did. This particular machine. So in order to get past the FDA, manufacturers had to promise to build a new machine, one which was safer and which one did not produce brain damage. There were many complaints about brain damage and long-term memory association connected with shock machines. So they came up with what is called brief pulse, and they came up with the 1982 American Psychiatric Association standard, which they promised the FDA they're going to adhere to. I've spoken about some of this in my previous videos, but let's just go over a little bit of some of that I've already gone over. So the 1982 APA standard consisted of two parts. One was a phrase called 70 joules at 220 ohms, and the other one was a 110 joule sealing stipulation. Now, once again, you may not know what a joule is, and if you're interested, a joule is equal to 1 watt per second, but that really is not important. They promised to hold it down to 110 joules, and they also promised to maintain this 70 joule at 220 ohm phrase, which I have had to find a name for, so I call it equivalent ratio rate rise sealing. Let me see if I can explain that to you just a little bit. The equivalent ratio rate rise sealing is an equivalent ratio to all other impedances. Impedances, this little sign right here, that is impedance or resistance to electricity. It's done in terms of ohms or resistance. If there's 70 joules of electricity or output or energy at 220 ohms, for a higher impedance or resistance, for instance, you created an equivalent ratio, and that would be, for instance, 95 joules. You can just see that you just fill in the blank here. You cross multiply and you get 95 joules. If, for instance, it was a lesser impedance of, say, 80 ohms, then you cross multiply again and you would get 25 joules. So while these particular outputs are not specifically accurate, they give you a general idea. For people with greater impedances are allowed higher outputs, and with people with lesser impedances or resistances to electricity, you must use lesser output. What this means is the output has to be gradational. For a younger person who has almost no resistance to electricity, you have to use a much less amount of electricity. For a much older person who has greater resistance, you can use a greater output. That's the general idea behind the 70 joule at 220 ohm phrase. The second one gives you the specific outputs per age category. It limits output to 110 joule sealing. We're also told in the APA standard that 100 joules is the minimum required, maximum output required to induce a seizure for all age recipients. This means that for the oldest recipient, the 100-year-old recipient, he or she will seize at 100 joules. As a matter of fact, will probably seize at much less than that, but it's guaranteed that anybody that is 100 years old or even older will seize at 100 joules. So 100 joules is considered the minimum amount of electricity required to induce an adequate seizure for that particular age category. Now, the 110 joules is the maximum allowed by the American Psychiatric Association. This was all invented by Richard Weiner, who was the spokesman for all the ECT manufacturers. You can see if we take 110 joules and divide it by 100 joules, we get a 1.1, and I have to create a name for this. I called it a multifold threshold titration level output intensity, or its 1.1 times threshold for all age categories. It has to be consistent over all ages, so all ages receive no more than 1.1 times threshold. This was the APA promise made by Richard Weiner that companies would adhere to from this point on. Now, just as we know that 100 joules is the minimum output in which all 100-year-old recipients will seize, will have an adequate seizure, which is defined as 25 seconds or more in length, we also have threshold outputs for all other age categories. Now, I derived these. I discovered these. Manufacturers have never revealed these. In another video, I'll explain how I derived these. But for instance, for the 10-year-old recipient, 1 joule, it only requires 1 joule to induce an adequate seizure for a 10-year-old male or a 10-year-old child. Again, here's the 100-year-old for 100 joules. But these are the thresholds guaranteed to induce an adequate seizure for each age category. And we need these in order to administer a 1.1 times threshold as the APA standard allows. So as you can see, here's the 1982 APA standard. So for the 10-year-old who seizes at 1 joule, in that age category will seize at 1 joule, you're allowed to give 1.1 times that, which would be 1.1 joules. For the 100-year-old, all of whom seize at 100 joules, you can deliver 1.1 times that, and that would be 110 joules. So the APA standard has a 110 joule limit, and it has a 1.1 multifold threshold titration level output intensity for all age categories. 1.1 times is supposed to be minimal stimulus, so that every age category is guaranteed an adequate seizure with the least amount of electricity possible. That is the APA standard that was promised by the manufacturers in 1982. As a matter of fact, the MECTA was presented to the FDA, and that was in compliance with the APA standard. You can see here that these outputs are 1.08 joules for the 10-year-old child, and 4.32 joules for the 20-year-old, and 108 joules for the 100-year-old. And you can see that this is in compliance with the APA standard. So the MECTA emitted 1.08 joules for the 10-year-old. It's allowed 1.1 joules. It emitted 108 joules for the 100-year-old. It's allowed 110 joules. And so the MECTA presented to the FDA was in compliance with the APA standard. Now, as I've implied in all the other videos, the manufacturers began violating the standard almost immediately following the close of the investigation. So by about 1983 or 1980, MECTA and Somatics immediately began to violate the standard. They start emitting not a 1.1 multifold threshold titration level output intensity, but about 2.5 times. So they have to do this because in order to make the machines work, they have to use adequate amounts of electricity. This is supposed to be adequate convulsion. It's supposed to be convulsive therapy. But in reality, the machines don't work unless you use adequate amounts of electricity. Now, this is really important because that which causes the damage is the electricity, is the excessive electricity. So that's why the APA standard was created, the least amount of electricity to utilize to induce adequate seizures. But since convulsive therapy is in actuality a myth. They really have to use enough electricity to destroy a certain amount of neurons in your brain. And so these manufacturers, of course, they want to cover up the amount of electricity they're using. And I'm going to show you how they covered up the 2.52 and 2.59 multifold threshold titration level output intensity of the second generation devices made by MECTA and Somatics. So here, for instance, is the second generation Somatics Thymatron DG, and it no longer puts out 1.1 times threshold, it puts out 2.52 times threshold. That is, they use 2.5 times the electricity required to induce an adequate seizure. Why do they do that? Because they need the electricity to damage the individual, to destroy a certain number of neurons in the brain in order to get the effect that they're looking for. Of course, they don't want to tell this to the FDA, and they don't want to tell it to any recipients. They don't want to tell it to the public, so they hide this. I figured this out. These outputs out by the formulas that are utilized for brief pulse machine. Here are the formulas if you're interested. Incidentally, Somatics gives enough information where I can derive the outputs and derive the parameters of these devices. MECTA does not give enough information. Somatics does not give you the maximum output, so I have to find these things. I have to derive all these things. But I was able to do it, and because MECTA is so close, even though they don't give me enough information, I can extrapolate from Somatics. So this is how I was able to derive these outputs. This is the Thymatron DG right here, and these are all the parameters. You don't really need to understand all of this unless you're an electrical engineer. But, we have the resistances per age category. We have the frequency here, the number of pulses which are administered. We have the duration, how long it's being administered. We have the current. It's a consistent 0.9 amps. We have the energy output, which is important. And this is the charge right here. But what we're particularly interested in is these joules here, this energy output. We can, and I've shown you in another video, we can change these into to wattage to make it more understandable. For instance, a 10-year-old child got a 1.08 joules over 0.703 seconds with the MECTA C, and then with the second generation device, he then got enough energy to utilize or light up a 2.7 watt light bulb for 0.93 seconds. The 100-year-old goes from a 54 watt light bulb over 2 seconds to 63 watt light bulb for over 4 seconds. In any case, they want to hide this amount here, and they want to make it look like they're conforming to the APA standard. So they find a way of cheating, they find a way of lying, and they find a way of falsely reporting to the FDA. Here is the MECTA JR1 and JR2. These are the MECTA devices. The previous one I just showed you was the Somatics device. It's very similar. They're both very similar. This puts out a 2.59 times threshold output for every age category, and these are the outputs they're actually delivering, way above APA standard. Remember, the APA standard limits everything to 110 joules. This one is now putting out 260 joules. Well, they don't want to report that, so they cover up this information. In fact, to cover up this information, they create the false impression of adhering to the 110 joule ceiling of the APA standard. And so, instead of reporting the 252 and 259 joules respectively that each machine now administers, they actually report the MECTA device utilizes 101 joules in conformity to the APA standard. Remember, the ceiling is 110 joules, and Somatics reports 99.4 joules. And even administering physicians read this. These are the readouts on the machine itself. So even administering physicians have no reason to believe that there's a second generation device which emits now 2.5 times that of the first generation device. So how do they cover up this output? Well, as I showed you previously, here are all the formulas pertaining to brief pulse. Now, I just took one of these. Energy output equals current squared times impedance times hertz times 2 times wavelength times duration. You don't really need to know about all this, but this is just one of the particular formulas that we're going to use to show how they covered up this output. So what did they do? So we're taking that same formula that I just showed you, and if we were to fill in that formula, this is what it would look like. Here, energy output, you square the amperage, you put in the maximum impedance here. This is for the maximum output. You multiply it times 140 pulses, you multiply it times the wavelength or the pulse width, you multiply it times the maximum duration, and you get the 252 joules, which the Somatics device actually emits. But what do? They use an average of 220 ohms that they put in for all the impedances. From the 10-year-old to the 100-year-old, they use 220 ohms. So if you put in 220 ohms instead of the maximum, you get 99.7 joules. Well, remember, the ceiling is 110 joules. So this looks like it's in compliance with the APA standard when it's actually emitting 252 joules. This is the MECTA device. It utilizes a maximum of 562.5 ohms. They put in an average of 220 ohms, and they come out with 101.2 joules. Looks like it's in compliance with the APA standard. Here's the other MECTA machine, the other second generation MECTA machine. You can see that these machines actually look like they're an improvement over the MECTA C, because the MECTA C put out 108 joules. These look like they're actually improved by utilizing even less electricity, even less energy output, in compliance with the APA standard. Remember, even practicing physicians are reading these outputs here. They have no reason to believe that the second generation device has actually increased in output. It actually looks like it's been reduced in output. All right, just so you can see how they did this with every age category, here's the Somatics device. Here are the false readouts on the machine. There's various impedances for the different age groups, so I just show you one of them. Here's the 70-year-old who has a 388.8 ohm impedance, and the output that is administered by default by the Somatics machine is 123.45 joules. So they substitute the 220 ohms, the 220 ohm average, and they come out with 70 joules. So you can see that reported for the 70-year-old is 70 joules when actually he's getting 123.4 joules. Here, by the same reasoning, they report 99.7 joules when actually the machine is utilizing 252 joules for the 100-year-old. We can see the same thing with the MECTA devices. Here are the false readouts because of the 220 ohm average that they use. Here are the real readouts. You can see that instead of the reporting the 259 joules or approximately 260 joules that they're actually delivering at maximum, they're reporting 101.4 joules. This is because they use 220 ohms. Again, I just show you the 70-year-old who has an impedance on this machine of almost 400 ohms, and he's really getting 127 joules, but they just use the average and it looks like he's just getting 71 joules. You can see it up here. So here are the false readouts. Here are the actual outputs, and that's how they have misreported to the FDA. Remember, they're not only misreporting to the FDA, they're misreporting to administering physicians, and they're also misreporting to the public, and particularly important, they're misreporting to the recipients of these devices, the patients of these devices. They're telling them they're getting a minimum amount of electricity to induce an adequate convulsion, when in reality they're administering brain-damaging amounts of electricity. So here is a chart on the APA standard, the MECTA-C, which was in compliance with the APA standard. Here's the MECTA device. I use this second generation MECTA devices. There were 2 of those, but they put out the same. Here's the Somatics device, the false numbers that they're using. And then here are the real numbers that they're using. I mean, this is what they're actually emitting. They're emitting 259 and 252 joules. They're reporting 101 and 99.4 joules. Here's the APA standard. It looks like it's in compliance. Here's the MECTA-C, which actually was in compliance. So you can see that this method gives the impression that they're in compliance with the American Psychiatric Association 1982 APA standard. So if we just look at the maximum outputs that are depicted on the machine itself, we can see that the maximum output by the 1982 APA standard was 110 joules, which was threshold output, just above threshold. We can see the MECTA-C in compliance with the 1982 APA standard at 108 joules. We can see what is reported for the second generation MECTA device was 101 joules, and what was reported for the Somatics device was 99.4 joules based on a 220 ohm average. And then in reality, the MECTA-C put out 108 joules because it really was in compliance, but that machine is not used after the showing to the APA. So the second generation device emits an actual 259 joules, and the Somatics device emits an actual 252 joules. So these misleading outputs defraud both administering physicians and the American public. Now, just for good measure, I want to remind you that there's also a third generation device out there. This is the one that is now being used. It is twice as powerful as the second generation device. Instead of putting out 250 joules, these machines put out close to 500 joules. So this is doubled yet again. But what have they for covering up the amount of electricity used for the third generation device? They have switched to charge. So here again is the 1982 APA standard limits output to 110 joules. The MECTA-C in compliance with 108 joules, but that machine is no longer used. So instead of reporting in joules anymore, they changed it to charge. When physicians read it, or anybody reads it, it's 1,152 millicoulombs, or 1.152 coulombs. The Somatics device is 1.005 coulombs, and it just, you can't compare the two things because they changed to charge. So in reality, the MECTA-C put out 108 joules in compliance with the APA standard. The third generation MECTA device puts out 460 joules, way above the APA standard. The Somatics device puts out 452 joules. These are the third generation devices, way above the 110 joule C stipulated by the APA standard. If you want to see this in terms of light bulbs, this has gone from, let's say, for the 100-year-old MECTA-C 54 watt light bulb for 2 seconds, to third generation 63 watt light bulb for 4 seconds. I'm sorry, that's second generation. Third generation 85 watt light bulb for 5.32 seconds. That's how much power is emanating from these third generation devices, which are guaranteed to damage people. Again, if you want proof of this damage, look for my first video. And that was on the Perrin report, and it shows you that every single person receives ECT, even standard ECT, even from second generation devices, is damaged. The neurons in their brain are diminished considerably. So next time I'm going to show you how Medcraft, the third device manufacturer, also violates the APA standard, but they do it in an entirely different way. In fact, the Medcraft brief pulse device is nothing like the MECTA and Somatics device. They both violate the standard, but they do it in different ways. So next time we'll talk about how these manufacturers actually interpret the APA standard in antithetical fashions and how they both violate the APA standard. I'll see you next time.